Welcome to the Future is Borderless podcast with David Nilssen. We feature top entrepreneurs and thought leaders from around the world, those who bring a global mindset and a unique perspective to their life and business. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hey, David Nilssen here. I'm the host of this podcast. On The Future is Borderless, we connect with business leaders from around the world who have what I refer to as a borderless mindset. And the idea here is to share ideas, shed light on new innovations, and then provide best practices, things that can help us grow both personally and professionally, and ultimately thrive in a rapidly changing world. Now, this episode is brought to you by Doxa Talent. Doxa helps businesses to source full-time, highly skilled workers from all over the world. And as a result, these companies can scale faster, increase margin, and improve culture. If you want to learn how to grow your business with offshore talent, simply visit doxatalent.com. All right. Well, I'm excited for today's show today. Our guest is Spencer Sheinin, who has a rare capability, the ability to speak in both the language of accounting and the language of entrepreneurship. He's been a CPA for over 20 years and has been an entrepreneur, owning businesses in manufacturing, construction, real estate, cold storage, and now financial services. And with the goal of making accounting not suck, Spencer is the CEO and founder of Shift Financial Insights, providing ridiculously simple accounting and financial insights for businesses that are on the rise. And guided by the belief that entrepreneurs can change the world, Shift is on a mission to help small and medium-sized businesses remove their financial blind spots and turn the numbers side of the business from a pain point into a source of power. Now, I should also know that Spencer is a highly rated international speaker. I've actually seen him on stage and he is outstanding. He delivers engaging and actionable presentations and workshops to industry and membership associations such as TEDx, the Entrepreneurs Organization, and Tech Vistage. His keynote presentation is Unbleep Your Books, a surprisingly simple path to financial clarity. And it complements the lessons that he teaches in his best-selling book, Entreprenumbers. Excuse me. That's kind of a mouthful. Using the same drive and sports that he does with business, Spencer has completed marathons, ultra marathons, an Ironman, maybe more, distance cycling events, and even distance swims. So a lot. And with that, I want to welcome Spencer to the show.
Hello. How you doing, Dave?
Man, that is a lot. I've done a half marathon one time in my life, was able to check that off my list, and no interest anymore. It's pretty crazy to think that you've done all of those different things. Is this something that you would just enjoy doing, or is it something that you do to challenge yourself? What's the sort of motivation there?
I think a few things. And I should say, I don't do a lot of it anymore. Just, it's pretty abusive on the body, and my back is just reminds me that I'd rather be active than necessarily doing ultras. It starts just as fun, like I'm running with friends or in a club or whatever. And then it just sort of, you hear somebody does an ultra and then the little competitive juices start flowing. And then it just starts to be like, how far can I take this? Yeah. Ultimately 100 miles. I did a 100-miler one day. So in a day.
That's fascinating. It says something about your competitive nature, because I've also had friends who have said they completed an ultra and I never got the itch to try. So
I get that too.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your entrepreneurial journey. And in your bio, I talked about the fact that you've been an entrepreneur and a CPA, but can you clarify which came first?
Sure. The CPA came first. And I think I need to update my bio because I was a little mortified last year. I got my 25-year CPA pin. So that came from the Institute. And really it was as I was coming out of university, I didn't know what to do. Like I was just kind of like, I don't know. And my dad happens to be a CPA. He's been a tax specialist his whole life. And he's like, well, there's this thing called CPA. And I literally didn't know what it meant. Like I thought it was tax because that's what I knew from my dad. And so I became a CPA, or I went to school to be a CPA. And so we had a lot of article time where we'd have to work at one of the firms. I would drive to work physically nauseous. I hated accounting so much when I was doing it. So that actually came first. And kind of as you would get from that little bit we talked about ultras, I started down the path, even though I wasn't enjoying it. It was hard and it wasn't my thing. I stuck it out because what am I going to do? Not finish my degree when I'm halfway through. The accounting came first, but didn't stick around long.
Yeah. So how did you make the transition then? I mean, I appreciate, by the way, that you're going to work, you feel nauseous going there. Clearly, it was not the right fit for you. But like, how did you then make the transition into owning your own business?
Yeah, and really to some extent, when I ended up owning a few businesses, and there was a point in my kind of mid 30s, I'm like, how did this happen? So I had bought my sister and I, after I came back from university, we pooled our resources and bought a small duplex together to live in. It was just the two of us. And the realtor on that job came to me and he's like, hey, there's this interesting development deal around the corner. And through a long story, which I won't bore you with, I ended up borrowing some money from my dad, really, full disclosure, and doing this development deal where I ended up meeting a general contractor who built the house. And him and I just became really good friends. And, I think I was like in my early 20s at the time, and he was 15 years older than me. And we just got to be really good friends on it, really same integrity, same goals. We were always talking about business. And he literally said to me, he goes, hey, you want to go find a business to buy? And at that point, I was an accountant. I had been an investment banker as well. So I worked at one of the large Canadian banks as an investment banker. And he had no education. He'd never sort of had a traditional job. He'd always just had these businesses. And I'm like, all right. And again, long story, but we found the first business, which was a manufacturing business. We made skincare products. And I remember this was during before the dot-com bubble crashed. So like, I'm talking like we bought that business in 2000. So like, this is way back. And we walked into the plant, we saw lip balm going down the line like this. And we're both like, we get this. We don't understand the technology, at least back then. But I understand we just need to do this better than everybody else. Sounds easier than it was. I had the finance background. He had the operations background. And we made a good, that's how we found our first business. We bought it. I organized all the financing. We were over 90% leveraged when we bought the business. Some of that came from one of the vendors who became one of our minority partners. And there we go. We have this business. And then I thought it was easy. I learned running a business is totally different than being an accountant in every respect.
Turns out.
And it's funny because everyone's like, oh, you're a CPA, you'll be fine. I'm like, no, I had zero understanding of how to run a business. Zero. Everything I'd done up to that point is you go in for 2 weeks, you do your audit, you leave. You go in for 2 weeks, you do your audit, you leave. As an investment banker, you go in for 3 weeks, you do a deal, you leave. I didn't know what it meant to run a business.
Yeah.
And then fast forward, maybe 6 or 7 years later, my partner, who also owned a construction business building high-end custom homes in Vancouver, invited me into that business because he wanted me to come in. And by this point, I was building process and systems and starting to learn about business. I still have a long way to go. But he wanted me to basically extricate him from the day-to-day of that business. So I was invited into that. And then along the way, not too far off that, I became partners with my dad in a family business, which was a cold storage business. We had ultimately 4 facilities in Washington State, public refrigerated warehousing. Being in Washington, there's going to be a lot of fish, dairy, beef, actually even carbon fiber for the Boeing Dreamliner had to be kept at temperature before it was manufactured. So yeah. So that was sort of how we're the entrepreneur side. And I'll just finish the story with, there was a point in call it around 2010, where I woke up and I realized I was miserable again, driving to work nauseous, wasn't happy with what I was doing, and made a decision that it was more time for me to lean into more purpose of what I wanted to do and kind of what I'm called to do, rather than just having these businesses that kind of randomly showed up in my life in a weird way.
Yeah. So in your bio, I talked about the mission for Shift is you guys want to make accounting not suck.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean to you?
So I was at an event with the Entrepreneurs Organization. I was at a speaking engagement. There was a speaker, was a finance guy. Excuse me. Amazing. He great speaker, high energy. He was talking fast and quite technical, a lot of formulas. Now, I'm a CPA. I'm just naturally good at math. No surprise there. But I'm watching and I'm like, okay, got it. Okay, got it. Like it was intense. And I'm in a room full of entrepreneurs. And I'm kind of like, I don't think everybody else is keeping up. Like that's my gut. And at one point I put up my hand. I remember his name's Alan. I go, Alan, don't you mean 2.4? Whatever it was, because he'd made a mistake on one of his own formulas. And he goes, oh yeah, you're right. And the whole room like almost falls over laughing because they're like, I have no idea what's going on out there. And here's Spencer correcting him. And one of the guys at the table who I knew leaned over and said, hey, I know this stuff's important. I don't understand it, but I know I need it. Can you help me with it? And that was a light bulb moment, actually, after I made that decision around exiting all of the businesses and following my passion. I was like, oh, I'm actually super passionate about entrepreneurship. And I understand this language of accounting. And so maybe there's a way I can actually help support entrepreneurs, which I believe entrepreneurs can change the world. My role is to help them through their financial blind spot. So that's kind of where the passion piece came in. And kind of it was that one light bulb in the series of several light bulbs, which ended up creating Shift, which is what I'm doing now. And yeah, I hated being an accountant. And no, I don't do any accounting now. We have bookkeepers, we have controllers. I'm not allowed to touch my own books. I'm not allowed to touch the company's books. I have holding companies, not even allowed to touch it because if I touch the accounting, don't let me into QuickBooks. I'll do the analysis.
That's awesome. You know, it's funny. I've had a similar experience. I remember in Seattle, I went to an event maybe a decade and a half ago, a financial professional, and it was one of the most highly rated events of that year. And it was probably the least sexy. Yeah. And the next year they brought the same speaker back, same situation. And we realized at that point, so many entrepreneurs are financially illiterate or they really struggle with their books. I'm just curious. I mean, given your experience, like, why is that? Why is it that so many entrepreneurs just don't really have that sort of baseline understanding they really need to successfully run an operation?
Yeah. And I mean, I'm going to focus on kind of small, medium. You know, when you get to like the hundreds of millions, typically you can afford some really high priced talent to deal with it. But if you're like 2, 3, 5, 10, even 20, 30 million sometimes, it's hard to do that. So I'm going to say there's a couple core reasons for that. And one I already talked about, like I'm a CPA. I went to school for 3 years to learn how to write, create, and interpret financial statements. Most entrepreneurs didn't. The same thing, like when I got into the business and I was like, you're fine, you're an accountant. I didn't know how to run a business. It's a completely different skill set. Mm-hmm. And so I think about like, this happened years ago. I was quite sick. And like, I was actually really quite sick. And I know what you're thinking. It wasn't a man cold. Okay. I was actually sick. and at the time, this was a long time ago, I was dating an emergency doctor. And she said, if you're still sick tomorrow, I'm sending you for tests. And I was still sick. She sent me for some tests and I got an EKG and she looked and goes, oh, you might have myocarditis. Well, if you've ever seen an EKG, it's just a bunch of squiggly lines. And myocarditis is a potentially fatal heart condition. And I'm like, how do you know that? She goes, well, this line goes like this and like this. And she knows how to interpret an EKG. I don't. Financial statements are a technical document. There are rules about how you put them together. And even if you're somewhat financially literate, the thing I got about being a CPA is everything's a relationship. So when something changes here, I have an intuitive knowledge of what's happening somewhere else in the business. As a result, double entry bookkeeping, boring crap, but that's why it's complicated. So that's kind of like the first thing, the language, it's a different language. And then the other thing, and this is particularly relevant for smaller businesses, is I call it the accounting stack. If you were to go build a house, you have your general contractor, everybody knows that, in charge of the job. You got a bunch of sub-trades, everybody knows that, plumbers, electricians, etc. And maybe some laborers if it's a big job, hauling lumber, digging ditches, hauling bags of cement, whatever. We all know that's what happens on a job site. But when it comes to the accounting department, we often don't realize pretty much the same things exist, right? At the bottom, it's the bookkeepers, transactional functions, day-to-day stuff that most people think of as accounting. In the middle, the sub-trades is the controller, reporting and compliance. All the reporting stuff, sure, but the compliance, the boring stuff, the policies and procedures, the setting up the chart of accounts so it's read a certain way, those are the blueprints. All of that other stuff, the compliance, making sure the bookkeeper's doing it right, because otherwise, how do you know? And then at the top is the strategic function, which is like the CFO. The point of that story is if you're a small business, you probably have a bookkeeper running your entire accounting department. It's the same thing as hiring a laborer to build your house. You'd never do it. Nothing against bookkeepers. There are some wonderful bookkeepers out there. We have wonderful bookkeepers. They just don't have the skills of the sub-trades and the general contractor. Like they might know some, the laborer might know some plumbing, they might know some electrical, they might know how to read plans. You'd still never do it. So we're expecting too much from the wrong people who don't have the skills. And just like me, I learned how to do financials. I didn't learn how to run a business. Accountants know how to do financials, not how to run a business. So we end up in this vicious cycle where entrepreneurs are like, I should know this. I don't know what to ask. I'm embarrassed. So they kind of expect the accountants to bring them the insights into the business. Whereas the accountants are going, well, I delivered the financial statement, so I'm done. So that's kind of the vicious circle.
Well, it's funny. I'm thinking back on my early entrepreneurial journey. I started a business when I was 24. By the time I was 27, we had about 100 employees in Seattle, Washington. And I had one accountant who was running the entire show.
Yeah.
And I may have even over-titled that. And some of the pain points were, there's some real pain points there, but I'm curious because it is a common sort of pattern that you see. How does it manifest in the business? Like, what are some of the early symptoms or signs that you might be ahead of your skis?
I think I heard it summed up once by an entrepreneur who said, I'm just not getting the information I need to run my business. And then he leaned in, he lowered his voice and goes, I don't really know what information I need. I just know I'm not getting it.
Yeah.
Right. So it's kind of like that lack of control. If you don't know what you should be asking for, what you should be looking for, and why, that's kind of a sense of like red flag. There will be pain. And I'm not saying that to be like, kind of in your face. I mean, you said yourself, like you were 27. Like when I bought that manufacturing business, I was 26. We had more like 40 employees. So we were a little bit smaller. Luckily, I was a CPA. So I understood that, right? So the pains of when I'm not getting the information I need to run my business shows up a couple of ways. Really, the biggest one and the most painful is, hey, Dave, just letting you know, we don't have enough for payroll on Thursday. It's like, how do it's Tuesday. What do you mean? Right? Not having the lead time to make those decisions. Oh man, my vendors keep calling me for payment. Okay, we're not on top of it. So it's those things where it's like, I need to want to drive more profitability in my business. I hear that my industry, I should be having 12, 15, 16% profitability. I have 0. Why? Right? Understanding what's causing the problems. And I get it because it's painful to read. It's like, okay, I'm literally learning Spanish right now and I'm doing a terrible job at it because I don't think that way. So the pains are usually the surprises. The surprises are the pain. I wasn't expecting that. And it was a bit of a kick in the junk when it happens.
Yeah. Tell me then, like, so you guys started Shift, I should say. Who's your core customer and like, how are you guys differentiating in the market?
Yeah. So we typically say between about 2 and 15 million is kind of ideal. We have 2 core segments. One is professional services, a lot of marketing type agencies, managed service providers, consulting, anything kind of in that realm. And the other is, speaking of the job site, the sub-trades. So HVAC, plumbing, electrical, those types. So those tend to be the 2. I think it's partly because, particularly in the marketing and particularly in the trades, you're probably doing the job at a company and you're like, I can do better than this. Like, I've heard that story a lot. Like, I just thought I could do better than the company we were doing. And maybe from an execution perspective, you can, but, and I like the term you said earlier, you get a bit out over your skis when it comes to the accounting and finance. So 2 to 15 professional services and trades. And I also think that's where most of the pain happens. If it's like up to $1 million plus a bit, depending on the business, you can kind of know everything in your brain. You're kind of on top of it all yourself. You know who you owe money because you probably put the order in yourself. You've probably, sold the deal yourself. When you start get to 2, 3, particularly 5 is where it gets really difficult, where you don't have to rely on other people. 8, now all of a sudden it's all about systems and process, and you're kind of trying to keep up with what's going on rather than driving everything that's going on. So those are the times where the pain point really happens. You hit 20, 25, sure, maybe you can now pay $200,000 for a CEO or a CFO, pardon me.
Yeah. Now, okay, I was going to say, I think I know the answer to this, but why wouldn't someone hire that internally, that function?
Because of the accounting staff, right? So if you're a $2.5 million business, if a bookkeeper costs 40 to 50K, a controller costs 80 to 100K, a CFO costs 250 plus, there's no way as a $3 million business you can afford that. So, but the other problem is for a $2.5, $3.5, $4 million business, you don't need a full-time bookkeeper. You need part of a bookkeeper. You need part of a controller. You need part of a CFO. And so that's essentially what we do. We're a piece of all of those. And especially you don't need a full-time bookkeeper because they're probably being inefficient because systems and process may not be their forte. So while they're doing their best, there's just technology changes and ways to do things in accounting that just make it smoother and easier.
Yeah. So on one hand, you hire someone that's a little senior, they're not going to want to do the work, or you're not going to want to pay the rate to do the work.
Yeah.
And vice versa, you know, the opposite issue.
I've always said, like, a good controller does not want to be a bookkeeper, and a good bookkeeper doesn't necessarily have the skill. They can become a controller, right? So you've got exactly that. And I don't think when you ask kind of about what we do, I was clear that we are like the bookkeeper, controller, and slice of CFO for these businesses. Yeah.
Yeah. So you guys are the outsourced finance arm for these companies, so they don't have to pay for the full stack, but get the proper utilization.
Yeah. We just think that sounds boring. So we say we make accounting not suck.
Yeah. Well, I certainly like the way it sounds. My ears perked up the moment I read it.
We did just real quick, we did a trade show. It was in the HVAC space, and there was another accounting bookkeeping firm there. And there's lots of business out there. There's going to be lots of competitors, whatever, fine. I'd rather be friendly with my competitors. And the second time we saw them at a show, like they had changed their branding to something about accounting sucks. I'm like, okay, cool, whatever.
Plagiarism is a compliment.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's talk about, so delivering financial information is one thing, but actually helping the entrepreneurs to understand it, to make it actionable is another. So how do you guys play a role in that piece?
Yeah. So there's kind of three pieces to that. Number one, and this is more of like a tool, and, you know, I've done this talk a lot. And I actually, for a while, I was like, I need to stop sharing this information because I feel like I'm being like, it's just so obvious. But like when I ask people what their biggest takeaway is, they always come back to the data visualization, you know, is turning financial accounting information into pictures. And it sounds so silly, but like the best way I can describe it is, you know, imagine like a stock chart, just the classic stock chart where you've got how the stock is tracking and the volume at the bottom. Forget about any of the other technical analysis. Right? You can look at that and instantly know, is the stock going up? Is it going down? What's going on with the trend? There's a lot of trading. You can get so much data that if you looked at that chart in 1 second, you would know. Yeah. Right? So if you have your financials, and let's just take, I don't know, your overall expenses, just to make it simple, and you're charting on a simple line chart this year versus last year versus budget, maybe past 12 or whatever it is, depending on, we all have our preferences. But you can look and in literally a second go, are we going the right way? Are we going the wrong way? Are we on budget? Or are we not on budget? And it actually takes the need to translate financial statements into just our brains. 90% of the information that's transmitted in our brains is visual. We don't think letters and numbers. When was the last time you thought about a paragraph in your brain? We just don't do it. Yeah. So number one is to actually change how the data is presented, data visualization, in what we present to not only just our clients, but Shift is a client of Shift. When I look at our financials, I start only with the data and I go into the financials when I see something that I want. The other thing about the charts is when something's out of line, it sticks out like a sore thumb. You can't help but to see it. But if you're not used to financial statements, your eyes may not pick up on, like, maybe you're looking at a 12-month financial. It's like, even I get tired, my eyes get tired looking at that, right? So data visualization. The second thing, which I find, if you find financials difficult, this tends to be a big unlock for people. I don't care what business you're in, how big it is, how small it is, how many locations you have. I don't care about any of that. There are 5 parts of your income statement. Sales, assuming you're not pre-revenue. Your cost of goods, it's like the only accounting term I can't get away from. But, you know, just when I was in manufacturing, we made skincare products, so sunscreen, the bottle, the cap, the front label, the back label, the box, all of the materials that we use to make the sunscreen. and the labor to put it together. So just your cost of delivering your product or service, right? So sales minus your cost of goods equals gross profit, minus your expenses equals profit, right? But there's only 3 things you can do to increase the profitability of your business. You can increase your sales, price increase or throughput increase, decrease your cost of goods, i.e. increase your gross margin, or decrease your expenses. That's it. And so the question starts to become, which lever do I need to pull? Rather than worrying about all of these financials and what's going on here, which lever do I need to pull? Are we growing? Do we have a problem with our margin? Do we have a problem with our expenses? And yes, it gets a little more complex from there, but at the highest level, not having to worry about an 87-line financial statement, which lever do I need to pull? Which lever? I mean, it's called lever because you apply pressure to it that gives you leverage to move the business. And the balance sheet, which is even more complicated. For most businesses, particularly smaller businesses, am I collecting fast enough?
Yeah.
If I have inventory, am I moving it fast enough, or is it sitting on trucks or in warehouses? My manufacturing, I can't tell you how many hours of sleep I lost owning a manufacturing business because of inventory, right? Like I think at one point we had almost $3 million of inventory. That's literally just cash sitting in the warehouse, right? Inventory left the warehouse, we had money in the bank. And are you paying at an appropriate rate? A lot of people potentially pay too fast. You don't want to slow down so you hurt your suppliers or your relationships, but sometimes just that's an opportunity there as well. Capital equipment and debt are levers as well. They're a little bit harder to turn. You can't move them as fast. So in terms of thinking about the business day to day, there's only 6 things you can do. Sales, decrease your cost of goods, decrease your expenses, collect faster, turn your inventory faster, and pay appropriately. If that's it, and you figure out which lever is the problem, game changing. $15 million survey company, I was doing some coaching work with them, and everything looked good except their cash. Well, it turns out they were having a problem invoicing their customers through there's some chunkiness in the operations. So they would do, say it's, April 8th, sometimes they weren't getting their invoices out till the end of month, the next month. Then there was 30 days payments. So they ended up not getting, and sometimes they didn't get paid for 60 days. So they ended up not getting paid for sometimes 4 or 5 months after doing the job. By recognizing the receivables, your collections lever was a problem, we saw that the owner had gone from cutting checks for $250,000 to the business, super frustrated. That's not fun. I've had to do it myself. Not fun.
Yeah.
To actually having $2.5 million of cash in the bank by understanding the key lever. That was in about 120 days. Went from cutting checks to having $2.5 million in the bank by focusing on the lever that had the most impact. So those are kind of the 2 core fundamentals. And then it's about selecting the data to analyze. Once you know which lever is a problem, and this is where we probably can't get into it right now, but what are the analysis underneath? If cost of goods is off, what do I need to analyze? Labor, materials. Okay, if expenses are off, which expenses are the problem? How do we need to analyze it? That gets a little more technical. That's where you need somebody a little further up the accounting stack to know what the analysis you need are. But if I can understand it and it's quick, simple, and intuitive because I'm looking at a picture, I'm focusing on the key lever, and I have somebody delivering me the right analysis under to support the lever that's going to have the most impact on my business, all of a sudden it's not quite as painful.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting. Like even as you're talking, my energy's rising because it does feel so simple. And I think about when I drive a car, if I have to worry about how the engine is put together, terrible, but I can read a dashboard and I can actually drive the car reading a dashboard, right? So the whole idea of data
we didn't even really talk about the concept of KPIs. And so that can layer over. And I'm sure you've had those talks before. And it's kind of like Jerry Seinfeld said years ago, if my car breaks down, I pull it off the side of the road, lift up the hood, and I look for the giant on-off switch. Oh, here's the problem. Quick. I don't understand cars either, so I get it. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, let's switch for a second. I want to talk a little bit more about entrepreneurship in general. And I love talking to people who have been in peer-to-peer organizations like the EOs and YPOs because they're better at the 5%. I'm curious, what is your darkest day as an entrepreneur?
So speaking of EO, obviously, I've been a member of EO for a long time, and we were going on the Vancouver chapter retreat, and it was on a cruise ship, which is my private hell. Like I'm not a cruise ship guy. And I'd never been on a cruise ship before. And I'm like, and I literally stepped on board. I'm like, yeah, this is exactly what I was expecting. So my skin was crawling. I had just broken up with somebody that it was quite an impactful breakup. And I had just discovered she'd gotten back together with her ex from before me, like literally that same day. And I'm up on the top deck of the boat and I'm on the phone with my bank because this was the manufacturing business and inventory was our biggest lever problem. And it was a really hard one to solve because we had, I think, 6,000 or 7,000 SKUs, right? And if you go to make a bottle of shampoo and you don't have one ingredient, you can't make the bottle. So like, anyway. And so we were growing, but particularly manufacturing businesses, you grow, it eats cash. So I knew we were coming up against a really difficult cash problem. It was kind of one of those perfect storms where we were hit with a bunch of several bad months. Then we were growing again. So cash was already constricted. Then we started growing. So it was even more constricted, blah, 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 blah. And I'm on the phone with the bank as we're pulling off of the shore. And like, for sure, like up until that point, you're getting the loan. And as the ship's horn, that brr, as that goes off, the guy's like, I'm sorry to tell you, but I thought we were going to get the loan, but we can't. And like, I was so sure that was going to happen. I had no plan B. I had no backup. I had nothing else. And here I am taking off on this ship where where I'm on my private hell, like dealing with this relationship situation. And it was just one of those where everything happened on the same day, to the point where I literally hung up and I'm like sitting on that boat and I'm like, I literally don't think this business is going to survive. We don't have the cash to do it. So, I mean, I have a lot of other difficult moment stories, but that was probably the only time where I was like, there's no way through. Yeah. There's no way through. And that's an awful feeling because at the time we had 50 or 60 employees. And I imagine you can relate to, like, I felt responsible for 50 or 60 families,
100%.
Putting food on the table and having a career. And, we all think being an entrepreneur is all, yachts and expensive cars. And, for me, it was really a strong feeling of obligation to those that were relying on me. And so it was really the darkness of like, I'm going to have to, now we found a way through, but I'm not going to be able to live up to my commitments to these people who have been showing up every day to work at my company. Yeah. That was probably the biggest thing, even more so than the personal failure type of fears.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that you brought that up. I've talked about this before on other podcasts. When I think about my darkest day, definitely related to 2008. I was in the self-directed retirement space. At that point, the markets had collapsed. Real estate was in a disarray. Yeah. I was going through a divorce. I mean, there's lots of stuff happening at that time. And I remember letting go of one of my team members. And I was so upset because I knew that this person and everybody else that we were letting go that day was not going to be able to find another job. And I couldn't hold it together. And she ended up consoling me, right? Like that, like it, you said it, sometimes entrepreneurship looks glamorous, but there's a lot of like, if you care about people, there's a lot of responsibility that goes with it. So
it's heavy. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to talk just briefly. I know we're getting close to the end of our time, but I want to talk about you said earlier that you're not doing quite as much in sort of the endurance athlete space, but I'm just curious about some of the discipline that you've used interchangeably between those two that might sort of help people that are, sort of early in their career. Like what are some of the things that correlate between the two that have sort of helped you succeed in life?
It's funny. I was kind of thinking about this the other day. And I don't know that it's necessarily skills per se, but something I've appreciated with the grossness of going out and training. I live in Vancouver, so, it might be like 36 degrees and raining, which is colder than 20 degrees. Like if you're out for 5 or 6 hour training, it's just cold and it's miserable. And when you're in Vancouver, that's 4 to 5 months of the year. Or like, learning to run on tired legs. Like we would go out for like a 5 or 6 hour run and the next day go out for a 2 or 3 hour run just to like train ourselves to run when our legs didn't want to run, because that's going to happen. And so it's as much about the process of being comfortable, being uncomfortable, and welcoming discomfort in, because life is not comfortable. Our lives in today's day and age are ridiculously comfortable compared to the history of humanity. Like, it's insane. But even in our lives, we have discomfort. We're going to encounter discomfort, whether it's physical, emotional, financial. Things aren't always going to go our way. We're going to have bad times. And so, and there's a lot of kind of self-development theory around this. But just being okay, knowing that what I'm doing sucks, but it's actually going to help me in the long term. I believe in longevity of life. I believe in eating healthy, being healthy, because I enjoy life and I want to experience it to the most. So if I can't be okay with the hard times, it's going to make it really hard to just be a human, because we have hard times, especially as an entrepreneur. I mean, if I may, I'm the second book I'm writing right now, and because I've interviewed you for it, if I can say that, is called Entrepreneur Cases. And it's stories kind of like the one you asked me about the boat, of when was that moment where you just thought it was all going to evaporate? And then how do we create impact, positive impact in the world out of those experiences? So for me, it's about being comfortable, being uncomfortable, because it's going to be an uncomfortable journey. Yes, we hear about the 20-year-old entrepreneur that does X, Y, and Z and becomes a billionaire. Those exist, but they're not very many of them. Those are like such freaks. Almost every entrepreneur I know has almost lost everything more than once.
Well, finding discomfort, or finding comfort, I should say, in the discomfort. I think we'll leave it there.
All right.
We've been listening to Spencer Sheinin, the CEO and founder of Shift Financial Insights. Spencer, where can people go to learn more about the work you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, probably the easiest thing is shiftfinancial.co, not .com, .co, shiftfinancial.co. Somebody registered it and is pirating the site. So I'll leave that story. And you can also find me, Spencer Sheinin, on LinkedIn. And it's the last name is spelled Sheinin.
Cool. And we'll get all those resources put in the show notes. Thanks again for being on the call today.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you for listening to the Future is Borderless podcast with David Nilssen. Be sure to click subscribe to future episodes so you can hear from more top entrepreneurs and thought leaders. And we'll see you again next time.